people that work on my investigations teams are heroes. You think you've had a bad day at work? Well, some of them come in and they look at child sexual abuse material and terrorist content day in and day out as their job.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to episode 2 of the Trailblazer series for AWSN's Women in Security Mentoring Program. This episode features Julie Inman-Grant, Australia's first eSafety Commissioner, and facilitated by our very own Jacqui Loustau, Executive Director and founder of AWSN. In this episode, Julie and Jacqui talk about the importance of safety online, walking the tightrope between being proactive to achieve systemic change, and then moving into the other phase around protection, regulation, and what we really need to do about proactive education. Julie also shares about a little bit about her origin story, her very first job working for a US congressman back in the United States, her time at global powerhouse technology company Microsoft, and then moving over to Australia and how she's found the environment down under. Julie also shares a little bit about mentors that have inspired her along the way, as well as ones that she looks to today for her own support when she's seeking advice in the current climate and ecosystem. One of the many takeaways from today's session is actually about the need for proactive and preventative education and reporting for eSafety online. So as part of this episode, we'll be leaving links from the eSafety Commission on some of the resources that they've prepared, as well as links where you can report that kind of activity online. And by doing so, together we can help create a safer space for Australia and all of the digital landscape. And for those of you that are new to the series, this is part of the Women in Security Mentoring Program, and if you'd like to sign up as a mentor or mentee for the next intake, please go to the AWSN website here, and you can register your interest to join the program and join this fantastic community. So really, that's way too much talking from me. So why don't we get into the episode? Let's get it.
Hello, we're here today for our Trailblazer guest series recording with Julie Inman-Grant, who is Australia's eSafety Commissioner. In this role, Julie leads the world's first government regulatory agency committed to keeping its citizens safer online. Thank you for joining us today, Julia.
Thank you for having me.
So as we begin, could you tell us what the eSafety Commission does and its remit, and a bit about your current responsibilities as the Australian's eSafety Commissioner?
Right. Well, the eSafety Commissioner, as you said, was the first online harms regulator established in 2015, originally as the Children's eSafety Commissioner. But over time, Parliament has layered different schemes and broadened the responsibilities of the office. And our overall mission or remit is to help Australians have safer, more positive experiences online. And the best way to holistically describe what we do is through what I call the 3 Ps. Prevention, through fundamental research, understanding threat trends and harms, how those harms impact around people, communities, and society broadly, making sure those inform our education resources and our programs. So prevention through education and awareness, followed by protection. And protection is through our regulatory schemes, and I can walk through those later. But it's important to recognize that protection and regulation is applied after the harm has been done. So that's why I've decided to add on what I call proactive and systemic change. Now, in the security world, we've been talking about minimizing the threat surface for years, but there hadn't been as much talk about doing this in terms of mitigating or preventing personal harms. SD3, security by design, default, and deployment has been a big thing for at least 2 decades. But I decided to bring safety by design to look at the unique harms landscape and what we thought companies should be doing to assess risks and build in safety protections at the front end, but also staying ahead of technology trends. We know that technology is always going to outpace policy. So I wanted to take an 18-month to 2-year advanced look at what was coming so we could understand what the benefits are and how we harness those, and then what potential risks and harms we might be facing so we could get ahead of those issues.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So first of all, congratulations and thank you so much for, on behalf of all the cyber citizens in the world, for all of that you do for us. And that's really great and very forward thinking of you to be trying to really be a game changer in that. So I guess what I'd really love to know, I've been watching you for quite a while on social media. I see all the amazing things that you do and the change that you're actually making. But if we were to just jump backwards a little bit, as you first began your career in Washington, D.C. in the US Congress, and that was soon after Microsoft, I believe. Such an impressive start to your career. I'd love to know a little bit about what Julie wanted to do when she was a little girl. Was it always in technology? Was it you wanted to be game changer? Did you see yourself as where you are today?
Well, I grew up on a little island called Mercer Island outside of Seattle, and then another island called Bainbridge Island. And I was raised by a single mom, a sister, and a female dog. But I also had, my dad and a very incredible stepmother in my life. I used to play a lot with Charlie's Angels, so I had, those best satin jackets with red and blue. I definitely had a Farrah flick, skateboarded, all those things. So we used to do Hold It. So I think I always had the interest in being a cop. Now, this sounds really weird, but my mother worked with Ted Bundy, the serial killer, and when she was at the city of Seattle. And of course, I remember her retrospectively saying, Julie, always look into the man's eyes. The eyes are the window to the soul, and he had cold, dead eyes. And for whatever reason, in the Pacific Northwest of Seattle, there are a huge range of serial killers. So if you put those two things together, my first job interview out of uni in 1990 was with the CIA to do psychological and behavioral profiles. I had a series of interviews, and then they came back to me and they said, we really think you should be a case agent, and we need you to do all these polygraph tests and tell us every little detail about your life, and we need to find really honest people and then teach them how to lie, and not tell their parents and their friends what they're actually doing. You may have to deceive people. And I just thought, okay, I think I've glamorized this. But I knew that I wanted to go into safety and public service in some way, shape, or form. So my first job was actually working for my hometown congressman in Washington, D.C. Had big ideals and even bigger hair because it was 1991. And I was working on a range of social issues. And one day the congressman looked over my cubicle and said, hey, we've got this small little software company called Microsoft in our electorate. Would you mind working on technology and telecom issues as well as social issues? So that's when I started really working at the intersection of safety, social policy, justice, and technology before there was even an internet.
Wow, that's so interesting. And so what was your first role that was within Microsoft? What happened next, and how did you end up in US Congress?
So I worked for my hometown congressman. That was my first job. After that, I went to graduate school in DC, and I focused on it was a very, very early on social implications of technology on communications and culture. And then I went to Europe and I worked in Brussels and Italy. I decided to return home. I was going to put everything in my car in DC and come back to Seattle. I was sleeping on my friend's couch, and I got a call from Microsoft to be one of their first lobbyists in Washington, DC. And for those people who work in that DC world, when a major tech company hires a lobbying firm, they're either really forward thinking or they're in trouble. So I think it was the latter. I think the antitrust case that the DOJ had against Microsoft was on the cards, and it was a very, very different world. I often refer to that time as technology policy ground zero. There was AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe, AltaVista, Netscape, and Microsoft was there. But we really believed at the time, if Congress overregulated and overtaxed, there were like hundreds of e-commerce taxation bills in Congress. So For My Sins was part of the shaping of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is still there today. But of course, this was 1995, 96. I don't know. Mark Zuckerberg was probably in junior high at the time. He wasn't thinking about, creating Facebook at the time. And so social media wasn't even remotely on the horizon. But it's really interesting to see, here we find ourselves. The U.S. hasn't moved at all on any online harms or even privacy legislation. And, I guess a middle power country like Australia, we've always been kind of innovative, but it's really interesting that we've been the leaders and on the front foot in this space. And things are starting to change. And I can talk about our international engagement and what's really happening with online safety now, and regulators popping up all over the globe. But being first is great in some respects, but it also means you don't have a model, you don't have a playbook. So you feel like you're at the front of the peloton, pedaling up Mont Ventoux without having anyone drafting behind you. So it's a hard slog.
I can imagine. No, being the first, and like a lot of what we've been doing, we're looking at other countries to say, okay, what are they doing there? Can we learn from it? Can we then apply it here? But you really are kind of leading that charge. So how did you end up in Australia from the US?
Well, I had 5 very intense years at Microsoft, building the government relations function and the political action committee, which wasn't something that I was very comfortable with. Australia is very different in terms of its political system, and a lot of the reason things get done or don't get done in Washington is based on corporate giving. It just is. So and I was spending every waking moment going to fundraising breakfasts or lunches, dinners. At that time, Microsoft was referred to as the evil empire. So I didn't even want to talk to people about where I worked, because it would kind of, create a diatribe about what an antitrust monster it was. So I basically said, hey, I'm 32. I have no ties here. Microsoft, send me somewhere. I want to have a little more international adventure. I need to get out of here. So they sent me about as far away as they could, to Australia, and I had an incredible opportunity to develop Microsoft Australia and New Zealand's corporate affairs, which was government relations, industry affairs, and their corporate philanthropy. So I did that for about 5 years, and then they expanded my role to cover Asia Pacific, but with a focus on security, privacy, and safety. And I think back in 2005, that was the first time any sort of legislative gap analysis had been done Asia Pacific wide around security, privacy, and safety legislation. I also had the opportunity to work with our digital crimes unit. And that was really fascinating. And then that eventually led me to their trustworthy computing division as their head of safety and privacy back in Redmond at the corporate headquarters from 2009 to 2012.
Okay. And so then how did you start and that's how you then start the eSafety Commission? Is that?
Well, I spent 17 really wonderful years at Microsoft. I learned a ton. I really grew up there. I started when I was 27, left when I was 42. I guess I would say towards the end, great opportunity to work for Trustworthy Computing division. I would sit in quarterly product reviews where we develop heat maps and do risk assessments and think about how platforms would be weaponized, but mostly for security vulnerabilities and for privacy breaches. And I remember saying, hey, what about personal harms? Xbox is pretty toxic right now, and this was a long time ago. They're doing really great gold standard work now, and Skype was a problem. And this was really during a time that Microsoft was evolving into more of an enterprise company. And I introduced the concept of safety by design, and they just weren't interested in taking it on. So I'd done our first cross-company trust and safety policy and brought all these disparate groups together. But I realized at the time, online safety was not going to be a priority, and I wasn't going to be able to go any further. And so I think that's often key, is knowing when it's time to go. And I had three kids. I just had twins, so we went back to Australia. And then I ended up working at Twitter for a couple of years and Adobe before becoming the eSafety commissioner.
And so throughout this amazing career of yours, I can like, just by what you've been speaking about, you've really been in the forefront. Cyber and e-safety has really changed as all these new technologies have been developed, new laws, regulations. You've been part of all of that, and new actors have been emerging. So in your opinion, what would you say is one of the main things that people mostly get wrong or maybe misunderstood about working in this sector?
Well, I think the sector is full of people, and I mean the technology sector, who really join these companies because they want to do good and they feel inspired by the changes that technology can bring. And I think you can see so many examples of this. If you look at Tristan Harris, who went to Google as an ethicist and now is at, worked with producers on The Social Dilemma. There are a lot of people who kind of went in with this idealistic view. But at the end of the day, these are companies that have shareholders and need to maximize profits, and sometimes will cut corners and their priorities change. So I feel for people who work in the tech industry, and there's kind of been a little bit of a vilification of the tech sector. Sometimes elements of it may be warranted, but it isn't really about the individuals. It's about the collective, I guess, goals of the company itself. But I'd also say that people don't understand that online safety is a very separate and distinct discipline. We've worked with cybersecurity specialists that thinks cyber safety is cybersecurity and vice versa, and it isn't. The third thing I'd like to debunk is this whole binary discussion about, privacy and safety are totally mutually exclusive. I think there are many cases where privacy and safety are actually mutually reinforcing, and I just bring the example of image-based abuse or the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and videos. People come to us in great distress because it becomes harmful. It's a huge invasion of privacy, but it's also a serious harm. I'd say the same thing about, when we're taking pictures and we're posting and we're asking about consent. We're trying not to put pictures of our kids up that have a lot of PII. If you have too much data out there about an individual, it becomes a potential harm or a privacy issue. There are some more obvious tension points around things like end-to-end encryption and scanning for child sexual abuse imagery, but I don't believe they're mutually exclusive, and I don't believe that there can't be techniques, whether it's through metadata or looking at behavioral signals that can't get at this, or investment in homomorphic encryption tools to solve some of these problems. I don't think they're impossible and they're not intractable. And tension can be good.
Absolutely. No, spot on. I think, especially because we mainly come from the cybersecurity side, but the Australian Women in Security Network, we recognised over the last few years that there really is an intersection with some of these disciplines. We can't do things in isolation, and I think the more that we work with all of those disciplines, the stronger we will be. So I'm going to change the tone a little bit, or the questioning. I want to hear more about, mentors that you may have had in your life. That you've done some incredible things. Who is your village, or the people that are around you, and those mentors and allies that have really helped you throughout your career?
Well, I can think of a few, and again, this goes back to the women in my life that have inspired me. My mother grew up very poor, without a lot of education, and just had the wanderlust in her, and did amazing things. She left her small country town and went to New York and worked in politics and did really incredible, exciting things. So she overcame some pretty significant economic and educational barriers, and probably helped shape my outlook. And I also had a stepmother who's frankly a labor hero in the United States. In 1965, the Civil Rights Act passed, and she had started flying as a stewardess for Northwest Airlines in 1958. Now, as a woman, you could only fly till you were 32. You couldn't be married. You had height and weight requirements. You had to share rooms. Male pursers didn't have any of those same requirements. So in 1965, she applied to become the first female purser. You can imagine how the Northwest Airlines management reacted to that. They changed the test, skewed it towards males. She still blew it out of the water, but she basically fought them for 14 years in a major class action suit that went to the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the final opinion, and she won this case that she pretty much fought alone for 14 years on behalf of 32,000 flight attendants. So even today at 86, she's coaching flight attendants and women in the airline industry to make sure that they're taken care of in terms of their pensions and their health care. So pretty incredible to grow up with two women in my life who overcame barriers. So I understood what the barriers looked like, but I never let that impede what I thought I was capable of doing. And so, I'm fortunate to be inspired. And then I worked for some great men, frankly. I remember my first boss saying to me, I always hire young women out of uni because they undervalue themselves and overdeliver, whereas young men, way overvalue themselves and totally underdeliver. So I'm not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but having both female and male mentors is, I think, really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, what great role models you've had, and that's a great. Thank you for sharing that story with us. Can you think about some of those mentors that you may have had throughout your career, and how did you actually find them? So you mentioned, one of your managers was one of them. Have you actually gone and actually seeked out others that might help you in other areas of periods of your career?
I think always you've got to aim high. I mean, I know even now I'm a total outsider to the Australian public service. So many people on my team and people I work with started in the public service out of university and really literally grew up there. So to be American and from the tech industry and doing things really differently because I felt we had to be successful. I don't know if you would call me a disruptor or whatnot, but I've had very much an antibody response to some more traditional folks in the public sector. But then I found secretaries and really senior people in government who I think like that I'm taking a different approach. And so I've certainly relied on a few to help me navigate the system and understand, how the mandarins think and, when to work with the system and when to challenge it. So, that's certainly been important. I've worked with a lot of tech CEOs over time, and I would say that while they were well known, I'm not sure that I would ever have put them up as mentors in terms of necessarily how things should be done. It takes a very specific kind of personality to be a global tech CEO that can be pretty intense. And so while I can admire what they've done and achieved, I'm not sure that the means that I've seen would always be my guiding light.
I think sometimes being a change maker and can feel kind of isolating and being alone. Often, yeah, sometimes I also have that same feeling as well, like who can I really go to advice who's done this before? Like sometimes it can be quite isolating. So finding mentors or people that can guide you through that can be, difficult to find sometimes. But
Yeah.
So given what where you are today, what advice would you give to somebody who may be really keen to follow in your footsteps?
Oh, that's very sweet. I mean, I often have people say, did you dream of becoming a tech regulator? I'm like, no. I was very, very fortunate. I also believe that people make their own luck. If you're lucky to find something that interests you and you're passionate about, I think that's going to ultimately lead to success. I mean, even working at the intersection of security, privacy, and online safety for 3 years, I've always felt more passionate about online safety because it really is about the human condition and personal harms. I find that more interesting than talking about systems and processes and and data, frankly, and permissions around data. I care about the impacts on people, and I hope that's come through in terms of the way that I've set up eSafety and the way our investigators are crack investigators, but they're also trained to deliver compassionate citizen service. They're trauma informed. We've got well-being people that work programs around them, and teams are heroes. You think you've had a bad day at work? Well, some of them come in and they look at child sexual abuse material and terrorist content day in and day out as their job. Often in this field, particularly in law enforcement, you typically have somebody in the sex crimes unit, particularly child sexual abuse, for about 6 months, and then they cycle people out because of the psychological impacts. I've had some people doing this work for 10 years. So it's about building a really supportive culture, really appreciating that these people put themselves on the line every day. They're basically jeopardizing their own mental health. And we have to have things in place so that they can talk to each other about what they're seeing and that they're experiencing. This is not something you want to bring home and have dinner conversation about.
Yeah, no, I think that support mechanism for what they're doing and seeing is really important, and they are heroes. Like I think many of us have had people or have used one of your services in Australia. It is an absolutely critical service to our nation, and we're very, very lucky to have it. And having someone like you driving all of those different services to help all different areas, which is really important. So thank you so much for all that you do, and your whole team. Obviously, that's really important. And And it's interesting because a lot of our members, a lot of the time, or AWSN or women in general in security, one of the main reasons they get into security is because they want to help people and to protect and, make a difference in this world. And so I think a lot of the time, one of the reasons is that they know somebody who's been a victim of, cybercrime or been, abused online. So I think a lot of people tend towards, okay, I want to know more about this, and that's why they want to get into security, and possibly also, a career in, eSafety as well. So I think it's really interesting to hear that kind of pathway of how they can get into it, but also to be aware of the different areas in which you work in. It's not, sometimes they are going to have some unpleasant elements in terms of the job, but also I can imagine that it can be very rewarding as well for people that work within the
Yeah,
commission.
I've always said I much rather work with smart, nice people than, smart, mean people, certainly. But there is something that draws us all together. We're mission driven and passionate. You don't want any organization full of just type A people or just passionate people. So there is a balance. But the other thing that's interesting, having spent 22 years in the technology industry, is the entire time I was in the industry, the proportion of men to women was about 70% men to 30% women. I've now created an organization that's about 30% men to 70% women, so maybe I have to get the balance right the other way. But I think that nurturing side, that compassionate side, which is really required when you're dealing with the members of the public who are in distress. But it's also in terms of the content that we're trying to create. You have to be empathetic or at least sympathetic and want to work with other communities, particularly vulnerable communities, to make sure that the content that we're developing is age appropriate, culturally appropriate, and is authentic. So yeah, there's lots of room for creativity and innovation here. I mean, one of my first goals was I don't want our website to look like a government website. And it took about 18 months, but we can continue to update it and including our forms. That's one of my biggest goals right now is how do I get more Australians to know about us? How do I get people to actually seek out that help? We've recently seen some pretty some national issues, like around a young girl who was lured by some other teenage girls and then was brutally beaten and was in videos, and then a sentencing came down and the video went out everywhere, and people were horrified, and in their horror they captured screenshots and they retweeted, and they were showing their solidarity, but they're also their indignance, but also unwittingly at the time were continuing to spread the imagery, which increases the trauma for the victim and the family. And we see this a lot with child sexual abuse material. People are actually so angry about it, they retweet it, but they're perpetuating it. But we didn't get a single report from the public that content was out there. So how do we actually start to change behaviors of the public for people to say, yes, I can use a hashtag or contribute to a GoFundMe account, Justice for Kira. But when I see it, why am I not reporting child sexual abuse or pro-terrorist content to eSafety? Why am I not saying to my friend or to my child when they've experienced cyberbullying, hey, I'll work with you and we can report it to eSafety together. If it's too traumatizing for you, I can do it on your behalf. So we need to start changing behavior so that people will seek out this help.
Absolutely. And I think you've got all those different services, which allows different types of people to be able to report it, and all those resources also that are the audience. You've customized it for that audience as well, which is really powerful as well, because obviously to speak to different types of people, you need to communicate in different ways, and people interact with that information in different ways, which I've seen over the years. You've created some fantastic content with your team, not only just written, but video content, because everyone consumes information in different ways. And certainly, if there's anything that I'm sure any of the security community that is watching this webinar can do to assist you in getting that word out more, just let us know, and we'll definitely put in some of the links to some of your resources to try and get that word out there more. But certainly for the reporting, the more people that we know where to go to report it, the better, for sure.
Thank you. That could be the number one call to action. That would be great. And I have to say, the cybersecurity community has been so incredibly supportive. Even as we start to grow our own kind of trust and safety community globally, we're in the very early stages. So I've always been appreciative of how the cybersecurity community really leans in and understands the intersections between our two disciplines.
So if there's one thing that everyone takes away from this, it's to get that word out there when it comes to reporting, I think. Yeah.
Yep, and resources, and don't wait for things to go wrong. 95% of Australian parents tell us that online safety is one of their preeminent parenting concerns, yet about 10% actually seek out the information material. So being forewarned is being forearmed, I think.
Absolutely. And on that note, I'd like to thank you so much, Julie, for taking the time out of your very busy day to do this interview with us. That has certainly been the most amazing interview that I've ever had. And I really appreciate all that you do for everybody and all the digital citizens out there.
Thank you. And I love your work too. So keep it up.
Thank you.
Cheers.